All right. So yesterday we talked about we talked about direct variation. Today we're going to talk about indirect variation. All right. So indirect variation is going to be the opposite of direct variation. So indirect variation is also known as inverse variation, which is the opposite. So if we can recall, let's recall real quick. We're going to recall that direct variation is going to be defined as y equals kx, all right, where k is not equal to 0. And the coefficient of k, or the coefficient of k is going to be considered the constant of variation. All right, so let's recall that the direct variation is going to be y equals kx. K does not equal to 0, and the letter k, or the coefficient of k, is going to be the constant of variation. So indirect variation is going to be defined as y equals k over x. Now, let's look at these two. I'm going to put direct variation dv, and I'm going to put an arrow here. So y equals kx. And then let's compare it to IV. I'm just going to say indirect variation. And we're going to say y equals k over x. Now, we know that the word inverse is opposite, right? So if you notice here, in that direct variation, the k and the x are being multiplied. So the opposite of multiplication will be division. So in indirect, they are being divided. All right. So that is the difference. In direct variation, it is being multiplied, k and x, and in indirect variation, k is going to be divided by x. All right. So now, like, are there any limitations on the fact or on indirect variation? The answer is yes, there are limitations. So let's look at this. So we know that indirect variation is going to be defined as y equals k over x. So in this case, y cannot be equal to 0. K cannot be equal to 0, and x also cannot be equal to 0. Okay. Now, when I say that they cannot be equal to 0, there is a little bit more complexity to that. They can't be equal to 0 at the same time. All right. So if k equals to 0, all right, if k equals to 0, then x can be any number except 0. Okay. If k equals 0, then x can be any number except 0. Okay. All right. So what happens if we have a problem? Let me see. So what happens if we have this? Y equals 40 over x. All right. What happens if we have y equals 40 over x? I will ask you, is this a direct variation or a indirect variation? Is this a direct variation or an indirect variation? You would say that this is indirect because it's in the form y equals k over x. All right. Y equals k over x. So in order for us to have indirect variation, it has to satisfy two requirements. So there's two requirements for indirect variation. So two requirements for indirect variation If we were looking on a graph, indirect variation would be nonlinear. All right, non-linear, which means it's not a straight line, okay? And then the other requirement is that it will be in the form y equals k over x.